Hi, everybody, and welcome to our very final milestone, which is milestone 5. So we have 3 tasks in milestone 5. This is task 1, and then task 2 is where you're going to be. Well, actually, we'll take a look at task 2 in my intro. So let's just take a look here. So what we're doing in task 1, I should say, is just actually creating the composition. So we're creating 2 different compositions, and you had a choice between 2 different creative prompts. One was let's see here, maybe like a wallpaper pattern or textile pattern, something like that. See a few examples here of that. Here's another one. And then the other creative prompt was some sort of artwork, like maybe for some type of book cover or album cover, maybe a poster, so I can see, some, potential different. This actually looks a bit more like a textile. Maybe this is a textile too, but maybe I'm going to say these are a little bit more on the album cover. So I'm actually just looking for, when I look for the wallpaper pattern, I'm looking for maybe a grid. But you could have a little bit of a hybrid of both, or maybe it could be for, something that could be for an album cover or a textile pattern, so I don't think it really matters too much. But what we're going to do in this particular critique is we're just going to take a look at the different compositions and hopefully choose one of them that might be the best one to move forward with. And then you might be doing a little refining on both of them or one of them for the next phase. And then actually, so I want to just move ahead and talk just a minute here about task 2. So let's just head in there. So like you have done previously, you're going to take one design and then you're going to create 2 different color harmonies from that same design. But this time you have all of the different color harmonies that we have studied. So you can choose from the monochrome, the analogous, the complement, split complement, the triadic, or the tetradic. So, whichever one you think works best for your particular design or something you think you just want to explore more. What you're going to be doing is using tints, shades, and tones of the hues in each harmony to create the color schemes. I'll talk a little bit more about that particular requirement in just a minute. Choose value and saturation that supports your concept or your content. And that just means, something to think about is, do you want your design to be, when I think of value, I think of, remember when we did key, the very beginning, low key and high key? You can kind of think about that. Do you want it to be a design that looks a lot like has a lot of light values in it? Maybe it's has darker values. Maybe it's in between. It's a mid range. You don't think it should be light or dark. And saturation, you can think about, does it need to be more muted, or do I really want to go for more saturated colors? And sometimes it can be a blend of both. You can just have some spots of saturation that pop out, provides that accent. Okay, so as always, we do have some tutorials here, and we have some examples. And so I'm actually going to take one of the examples here, down here. Let's just take a look at this one in Photoshop. Hold on a second. So, here's the design. It looks like a wallpaper pattern or a textile pattern or a wrapping paper pattern, something like that. And this student chose complementary and split complementary. So when you choose your harmonies, again, you can choose any harmony you like. I'd ask you to just choose 2 different harmonies, like maybe not 2 complements, but maybe like if you decide to do complement, choose one of the other ones just to kind of mix it up a little bit. And the other thing I would ask you to do is to avoid making the colors too similar. Like this one it actually does have some similarities. So there's some red and green here, and this one is teal and green. But they are quite different. There's a lot more green in here. It's a different type of green. This is more of a true green. This is more of a blue, kind of bluish color. So just kind of try to experiment with the different hues, because it is possible, even though you're choosing different harmonies, if you're like clever, what you can do is like mix and match so that you get a design that, even though the harmonies are different, the colors can look very similar, and then you can get a design that maybe is not that a creative or exploratory. So see if you can make them a little, substantially or somewhat different from each other in terms of the hues you chose. That's pretty easy. I think everybody will do that. The final thing I just want to say is, so the assignment asked us to use hue, or I think it says tints, tones, and shades for each of the hues. And you guys know what that means. It just means, like, so in this particular complement right here, we've got red and green. Okay, so what you want to do, let's just start with the green here, right in here. You want to make sure, or maybe I'll start, yeah, I think it's a little bit different here. So you want to just make sure that you're not just choosing one part of the color picker, like right in here, and having all of that hue in the entire thing, just one single area. You want to mix it up a little bit. So in here, I think here it's a little bit different. We're kind of playing with like the different. Now we've got a darker tone. You get the idea here that you're kind of just want to sort of experiment a little bit more with each one, and you do the same for all the hues. So you're really like playing with those tints, tones, and shades a little bit. And of course and it's nice to have repetition. So repetition is, like, you can see here that there's quite a few areas in here that are the same in terms of the value and saturation. It's just that there is a little bit of experimentation with that. Okay, I think that's it. That's all I want to say here. Let me know if you have any questions, but hopefully that clarifies a little bit about task 2. Okay, Eliza. Okay, yeah, so it looks like you've got 2 different patterns here, and yeah, I think both of them are pretty interesting. This one is, based on the like triangle angles, nice pattern. I think that looks really good. And this one too is interesting. It's based on a sphere, and again, you've created a fairly, gridded out. It's a little. I'd say this is a little more asymmetric. It does have a little bit of order, but then also a little bit of asymmetry. I don't know. I could see both of these working. I think it just depends upon what you want to do. With this one, I can see this one to me is has a lot of interesting possibilities. I can see with this one breaking it apart even a little bit more in terms of, like, I could see maybe adding a few more stripes, or breaking this little part into little bars, something like that. The reason why I mentioned something like that is that when you have a few more elements to fill in, then you have more color places that you can work with color, experiment with color. So that's always a good thing to do. This one is feeling pretty resolved to me. Like, maybe I would like add a little bit more of that, breaking it apart a little bit, the shapes, in terms of just using the existing structure and just maybe doing something like, I could even see adding circles in, or just kind of like shapes within shapes, that kind of thing. This one I feel like would take a little bit more to resolve. Like, it doesn't quite feel like these big shapes are quite working yet. But this is starting to feel more resolved, so you might have to experiment with this a little bit more. That's okay. If you really like this one, then I would go with this one and just keep experimenting, or go with this one. And when we get to really when we're working on designs at this phase, what we do as designers, we experiment with a couple different options and just see which works the best. It's like a way of just liberating ourselves from just one single design. We can get very sort of stuck on things that way. When you have to do more than one, then you get a little more creative. And so at this stage, both of your designs don't necessarily have to be at the same level. You're just kind of trying to find one good option, So, okay, I hope that's helped, and I'll be curious to see which one you choose. Okay, Janae, yeah, you definitely understood the assignment. You have I really do like both of these designs quite a lot. They're different, but yet they have a little bit of a kind of a certain sense that's similar. And And I'm glad you spent a lot of time working on it. That's great. Sometimes that is just what it takes, where you get really good results that way. So I don't know. I think both of these designs are really good. I'm leaning a little bit towards this one at this point. It feels maybe a little more resolved, although this one's really interesting too. This has a bit of a Kandinsky feel. This one is a little more asymmetrical and a little more kind of informal with all of the different parts happening, whereas this feels a little bit more on the symmetrical side, so it feels more naturally resolved. It's another one of those things where I think, again, this feels like almost like pretty much like close to being resolved. Um, I think you could definitely move forward with it. This one feels like maybe you could experiment with it a little bit more. So, just decide which one you want to choose. I'm kind of leaning a little bit more towards this one. But again, if you have a strong preference, go for this one. If you can, when you submit this later, if you can like turn on the mask, it looks like maybe that edge, that might just be because you have a white background that you're missing that. Sometimes what you can do here is, let me see if I can find an example, is you can put in a background. It can be a very light background, but the background, you probably will not leave your background white later, so you can kind of pop in a background and, again, just a gray, and what that will do is it'll define those edges for you. So that's really the only thing I would do here in terms of your designs at this point. Otherwise, again, I think you're ready to move forward and, choose one of these. Hi, Bianca. Yeah, so yeah, working with circles and a little bit of a stripe, that's great. Yeah, nice job. And I like the idea of working with, the pattern. Why not? It's a great way to work with color. So yeah, so okay, so this one right here, this one actually feels really resolved right now. It just has a sense of being very ordered. It's because I think you did a lot of repetition, which I think looks good. So I could see definitely moving forward with this one pretty easily. This one I like too, though. I really like the circles within circles. I think that looks super cool. It feels like you. So the background at this point is a very orderly grid, and then you have what's happening here in the foreground is these elements that are a little more free floating. So if you want to go with that aspect, what you want to do is just keep experimenting with moving these around, the sizes, the placement. I wouldn't hesitate to pull them off the edge like that. They'll be masked then, some of these bigger ones, and really kind of play with it. When you work informally like this, it's just a matter of sort of experimenting. Like maybe you have to move some of these smaller ones above and the bigger ones below. Just kind of play with it until it works. Alternately, what you could do is something more similar to this technique, which is to make it symmetrical, like take one or more of these and just create like a pattern on top of the pattern you have on the background. Do you know what I mean? Like just line it up, make it super orderly. That can be an easy solution to a situation like this. So just to summarize, I think this one seems pretty resolved at this point, but this could be really good with just a tiny bit of work too. So feel free to choose whichever one you think is, the most interesting to you. Okay, Cassie, yeah, both of these, it's interesting. Again, they have a little bit of similarity, but they're quite different. I would say that this one to me seems most resolved. It just seems like very, all of the diagonals are working and along with this shape, and I like the way you've intersected these shapes over the the crossing. It just seems to have a lot of coherence to it, and also just the bigger smaller shapes here, the repeating, that looks great. So I would be inclined to just go with this one. It just has a strong feel to it. And if I went with this one, what I might do too is maybe add like a few more shapes in it. And the reason why is just to be able to manipulate the colors more, like to have more options for colors. Like for example, you could put like maybe a circle within here, or you could duplicate this shape and have them smaller going in, or experiment a little bit more with that. Yeah, I think that's all you would really need to do here is, again, just give yourself a little bit more, shapes to color, basically to color in and experiment with the tints, tones, and shades. Okay, Sora. So I hope I have the right file here. I downloaded, I think I downloaded the second one. In any case, I hope that they look quite similar, but I know that there's probably some differences. Yeah, oh yeah, so in terms of like the deadlines, um, deadlines are important, but I always do, if you were like an hour or two late, that's to me, that's not, I don't count that late, even at more than a few hours. As long as when I arrive, if I'm heading into the classroom in the morning, as long as I have something to review, then to me that's on time, um, because and other instructors have different rules for that. That's just my own personal rule. I always have a little bit of a grace period. Okay, so it looks like you have, so yeah, wallpaper pattern here, and maybe I think what you said here was an album cover. I could also see this as some type of textile or other kind of pattern as well. Um, so I would say, so I'm leaning a little bit more towards this one at this point, just simply because I feel like there is more shapes here that you can work with, and you've heard me talk about this now, like just in terms of filling in the shapes. So I think this would be a really good choice to work with, is to experiment with that. And this one again, it doesn't, if you just, even if you count the number of shapes, there just isn't as many shapes to work with. So I think if you wanted to go with this, you would need to, maybe experiment with adding more shapes into it, like, and again, I'm a really big fan of repetition, like just taking one shape and repeating it and creating little patterns with it so that you repeat the same shape over and over again. So if you wanted to work with something more like that, like this side, that's probably what I would do, is just to keep experimenting with it. Okay, Joe, so this to me looks more like the maybe book cover or album cover, that kind of more of a something along those lines, maybe something to do with space. Yeah, both of these I think could work. This is quite intriguing to me. It's quite unusual, this particular um, design. I've seen a lot of solar systems in design, but I have never seen anything quite like this. So I'd probably be inclined to work with this one, um, and see where you go with this. I could see maybe also working on the background a little bit more. If you may have encountered well, yeah, I think you could maybe, create a pattern in the background or break it apart a little bit more. Turn on your mask for sure, just to make sure you mask out these edges when you present it. But yeah, let's go with this one. We can experiment with it more. In the next phase, I could see sort of, again, maybe adding a little bit more to it so that you have more to work with in terms of the colors. But I would definitely go probably with this one. If you went with this one here, what I would say is to go back to um, the milestone that we worked with diminishing size and overlapping shapes. That was depth, because that would be like ideal for this particular type of design. So you really take advantage of how diminishing size and overlapping shapes and color work together. That was back in, I always forget now what we're doing in each of the milestones. I feel like it was milestone, maybe that was milestone 2. Anyhow, task 2 for sure. Yes, so that was milestone 2. Okay, Daedriona. So yeah, so you've got 2 different designs here. It looks like you're working with a pattern or a textile design for both of those. Um, so I really love fleur-de-lis. That's really one of my favorite shapes. But for this class, you really do want to make sure that you're like working with shapes that you've created yourself, so you may want to just experiment with simpler shapes for this. But I definitely like that, this idea. Maybe there's something simple about this, like a curving part of the shape or something that you could work with, build with the pen tool. There's some, good tutorials on working with the pen tool, I believe, last week in the milestone. In those video tutorials, you might experiment with a little bit more with that. But if you don't know how to work with freeform shapes, which are always a little difficult, just do feel free to just work with basic shapes like rectangles. You again, that assignment we looked at in Photoshop a little while ago, where we just looked at the colors in for task 2, you'll notice that was entirely built out of rectangles, so there's no need to go further. And I might even say the same thing with this one too. It just it feels like maybe a little bit like it could go a little further. I do have this really great example. When you're working with a shape like this, which is a little bit of what we call a cliched shape, like maybe there's some way that you can work with this a little more inventively. I do have an example somewhere. Hold on. This is a really interesting, just a file I keep that another faculty member created, showing how you can take one of these, what we call a cliched shape, which are shapes that we tend to see a lot in design, which can be made more interesting if you kind of start thinking a little bit more out of the box and, like a designer might. And so, for example, like these paw prints, like what if you were to say, do something really interesting with them in terms of size and overlapping and really kind of experiment a little bit more with them. You can see all these different cute designs, are made out of really simple shapes, but then through little kind of creating little patterns and really just experimenting with all kinds of different possibilities, that you get something that's quite unique. So that's what I might do, even though I think that it might sort of take your design away from being a pattern. I think that's okay. Sometimes patterns, unless you're, sometimes they work, sometimes I don't know if they always work with every shape. You might want to give that a try. Just experiment with that one a little bit more and see what you can do with it. Okay. Oh, good. You use some inspiration. Why not? Yes, it's really good to get inspired, especially when you're starting out as a designer, to look at other designs or artworks that you really just really like, and then just sort of riff on it to create something new. Generally speaking, when you do that, you'll always kind of come up with something original anyhow, because just of the nature of the way you play with things and kind of integrate them. So, oh yeah, both of these are interesting. I'm really leaning automatically to this one. This one has a really interesting, I really like this big shape in the background that activates the space. And then you've got this interesting vertical line, which you're repeating through, even through here, and then this shape in here. So it brings it all together. And then you break it apart with a little bit of this circular element, which actually picks up on the circles, the curves in the background. So it actually, even though there's a lot of different unique shapes in here, it all just harmonizes. So I'd be inclined to go with this one right away. I think it's pretty interesting. Okay, Cameron. Wallpaper design, good. Sort of like, it sounds like sort of something like planetary, which is great. Nice, you can always do really interesting things with that. Yeah, I think both of these designs are good. I'm immediately attracted to this one. I really like what you've been doing here. It's interesting what you've been doing here with taking these bars and then sort of playing with, sometimes the circles will like intersect where they intersect. Um, I think that, yeah, I think that looks really, it's a nice kind of play between the free floating shapes and then the kind of more of the grid. So for this one, the only thing I would work on here at this point is I would watch adding ovals in. You've got a couple of ovals here and then a lot of circles. I think if you're working with ovals, which are always a little hard to do, I have to tell you, then you always want the ovals to sort of be the same kind of amount of being squished, sort of close to the same compression, and then also the same orientations. And then in general, you don't tend to mix ovals and circles. You kind of pick one or the other. That way the ovals won't look like a mistake. They'll actually look very deliberate. So yeah, so I might just play with that a little bit more. This actually reminds me a bit of like some kind of like 1950s or 60s like patterns, like Formica or wallpaper patterns from that era. I don't know why it really has that vibe. Anyhow, yeah. So this one too, I think is I think this one has more potential. This one could too, maybe with a little bit more experimentation. It's okay too. If I hadn't seen this one, I would be more inclined. I would, be happy with this one, but I think this one has more, again, more potential.